What happens when a family historian drives home after a long weekend in York on their own about 18 months ago with no time constraints in nice weather, and they just happen to see one of those road signs with the brown boxes, generally used for places of interest on the historic sites and that sort of thing. At Kirk Hammerton, about 5 miles outside York city centre, there is one of these brown signs. It told me that I was in the vicinity of an ancient church. The weather being nice, I stopped to see whether the church was open. Before I go digging into the history, perhaps what we should do is to begin with a very basic question. Exactly how ancient are we talking? Oddly enough, to get an idea of the answer, we actually only need to go back to the late 1880s, when the Otley News and West Riding Advertiser printed a description of the building. It is dedicated to St John the Baptist, and having the prefix Kirk shows that it is of Saxon origins. There is no doubt whatever that the church was erected prior to the Norman conquest, but it is a vexed question, don't you just hate those vexed questions, amongst archaeologists as to the precise date. I've always understood Kirk to be a Viking or Norse suffix or prefix, and you may know that in 866 AD the Vikings actually founded their capital in England at a place that they called Jorvik, and we now call York. Historically speaking, the Saxon period of English history is defined as roughly 410 to 1066 AD, so in other words, the bit between the Romans leaving and the Norman conquest. The Oxford English Dictionary also tells me that the earliest known use of the noun kirk for church is in the Old English period, which they reckon to be pre-1150, which means it's been around for roughly 900 to 1000 years. But that doesn't tell us why this ancient church at Kirk Hammerton was even mentioned in the newspapers of the late 1880s. According to the Otley News and West Riding Advertiser, it was simply because it was in great need of restoration. The projected cost was estimated at between £3,000 and £3,500, not an insignificant sum. So to raise funds, on the 2nd of August 1889, a bazaar was held in a marquee in the park next to Kirk Hammerton Hall. Various crafts were on offer, plain and fancy needlework of all descriptions, cushions, fans, bags, baskets, prints, dolls, and a miscellaneous array of Japanese curiosities. It doesn't tell us what these Japanese curiosities were, which is a bit irritating. I would quite like to know myself. And slightly more annoyingly, the newspaper did not tell us exactly how much was raised on that day. But this wasn't the first time that people had been interested in the historic church at Kirk Hammerton. "16 years earlier, the Richmond and Ripon Chronicle of February 1873 was far more interested in the architecture of the church. In their view, the tower was the most interesting portion of the structure, being unusually lofty and perfectly plain to the height of the belfry stage, which is divided from the lower portion by a string course of projecting stones. It went on to give us quite a lot of description, mentioning that the windows are circular. The head of each window is apparently one stone. The imposts are chamfered, and the jambs formed of 3 unequal sized stones. The shaft dividing the 2 openings is cylindrical and has probably had a base coming down upon the string. That's a lot of technical architectural speak there. But what's interesting about this is that it's actually pretty much a description of the photo that I took 18 months ago, even down to the one-piece window headstones and the unequal stones that were making up the edges. Maybe it hasn't changed that much in 150 years. I've long had a theory that you can learn an awful lot about the local past just by having a look around the average churchyard. And indeed, in the churchyard around Kirk Hammerton, there are certainly 1 or 2 interesting stories hiding quietly in plain sight. 2 gravestones particularly caught my attention. One was for Robert Oxterby and his wife Anne. Another was for Hannah Oxterby, who died aged 20 in 1806. Oxterby was not a surname that I'd come across before, and I wondered, could it be local perhaps? Robert Oxterby's stone said that he died in 1822. He was 78 years old, so he was never going to be on the 1841 census. But I did find a reference to a man of that name in Bain's History Directory and Gazetteer of the County of York, which was published in 1822. Very contemporary. This Robert Oxterby, working with a John Oxterby, is said to be a corn miller. Is it possible that they are related to each other? Father and son? A couple of brothers? Cousins? Maybe there would be a clue in Hannah's burial record. Would you believe it? There was. Hannah Oxterby, daughter of John Oxterby of Kirk Hammerton Miller, died October the 7th, 1806. 20 years. By a consumption. So she died of consumption, tuberculosis as we call it today. Buried in the churchyard, October the 9th, 1806. Yes, indeed she is. And baptism records also tell us something about Hannah's grandparents on both sides of the family. That's how much detail this parish register went into. The gravestone for Robert Oxterby suggested that he'd been born in around about 1752. He and his wife Anne had 4 children, all baptised at Kirk Hammerton, so they lived there a while. And at least 1 record confirms that he too had a father named Thomas. And that record is for the baptism of his son Benjamin. You could make a family tree out of that. Although John and Robert Oxterby themselves were not baptised at Kirk Hammerton, one common detail did connect them. Both of their fathers were named as Thomas and Miller, and 10 miles away at Sheriff Hutton between York and Malton, there are actually a couple of likely baptisms. On the 7th of October 1754, we have Robert the son of Thomas Oxterby of Stittenham, a miller. On the 8th of October 1756, John, son of Thomas Oxterby. So it's pretty certain that they are in fact brothers. This effectively gives us a multi-generation family group, so we can make The Oxterbys were not the only interesting records that I found. In the late 18th century, many of the burial records gave the cause of death as a long illness, a short illness, or a lingering illness. Not a lot to go on there. But other records were a little bit more descriptive. These take us right back into the world that was the late 18th century. For instance, on the 27th of August 1784, Mary, the wife of Samuel Freeman, died in childbirth. She was 28. The record goes on to note that Samuel was employed as a labourer to Michael Greggs, a bricklayer of Kirk Hammerton. So we know what Mary's husband did for a living and who he worked for. Not long afterwards, there's another burial for Katie Freeman, the daughter of Samuel, a labourer to Michael Greggs, bricklayer again. She died on the 2nd of November, and the register gives her age as 4 months. But I think, working it back, if her mother had died in childbirth in late August, perhaps she was only 3 months old. Easy mistake to make. 4 years later, a vivid picture is painted of the final moments of Thomas Pickering, a 59-year-old weaver, who died by lightning on the 19th of July 1788. He was buried 2 days later. Perhaps he was caught in a storm. And if you could, perhaps please spare a thought for Thomas Hannah, a 67-year-old labourer whose death on the 8th of September 1800 had been caused by bleeding of the nose. I'm guessing that this was something rather more serious than a minor inconvenience you might picture when first thinking of a nosebleed. This was clearly something a bit more dramatic than that. Earlier on, I quoted from a couple of Victorian era newspapers, and as we go inside this ancient church, what struck me about some of those articles was quite how accurately they were describing some of the features that I quite randomly decided to photograph 150 years later. The Richmond and Ripon Chronicle of February 1873 mentions that the south side of the chancel toward the west has a plain, narrow, circular-headed Norman window, and that eastwards of this, and at a greater height from the ground, is an early English lancet light. The eastern window is perpendicular, of 3 lights, with a pointed head filled with tracery, and the label is enriched with a 4-leafed ornament. Exactly what I'd photographed. It made me wonder, could it be that this anonymous journalist had been standing with their notebook and their pencil exactly where I was standing with my camera a century and a half later? Because those windows are essentially the same now as they were described back in 1873. When you remember that St. John the Baptist at Kirk Hammerton is supposed to have had Saxon origins, making it between 1000 and 1600 years old today, you suddenly realise that it must have seemed just as ancient to the Victorians as it does to us in the 2020s. The passage of time is very much a relative thing. Somebody else who must have known this little church very well was the Reverend Thomas White. Born about 1802 at Woodlands in Durham, he'd married Anne Elizabeth Milesworth in June 1834 at All Saints Church, Lanchester in Durham. Initially, they spent the early part of their married life at Ashby in Lincolnshire, where their daughter Marianne was born in 1835. Sons Thomas and Charles were born in 1837 and 1839, probably at Newcastle on Tyne, where baby Robert also arrived 7 months before the 1841 census, by which time the family was living still in Newcastle on Carlisle Street. Looking at the parish registers, I think that the White family must have arrived at Kirk Hammerton somewhere before the 29th of September 1844. That was when the Reverend White performed his first baptism there. Indeed, their own son, Gilbert Surtees White, was also christened there on the Christmas Day of the same year. And all this would definitely fit in with a notice that was placed in the Leeds Intelligencer in September 1846, when the Reverend White decided it was a great time to advertise his services as a tutor, which is something that a lot of clergymen tended to do at this period. Private tuition. A married clergyman, formerly of Queen's College, Cambridge, so we know where he was educated, residing at the retired and salubrious village of Kirk Hammerton, 11 miles from Harrogate and 10 from York, will take after Christmas to educate with his own sons, assisted by an efficient tutor, 6 young gentlemen in classic and polite literature. Terms £100 per annum. That's quite an expensive private education, I think. Address is then given Reverend Thomas White, BA, Vicarage, Kirk Hammerton, near York. I wonder whether, being in this rural environment, Thomas and Anne White felt that their little sons maybe needed a few more friends than the local population was able to provide. That would certainly be a logical reason for them to take in boarding pupils. The Whites moved on from Kirk Hammerton at some point after the 21st of October 1855, when Reverend White performed his last baptism there. And I cannot help but wonder whether he might possibly have used the Saxon font, which would prove so interesting to the history enthusiasts of Yorkshire around about 30 to 40 years later. The internet is a marvellous thing. The beauty of it is that you can find all sorts of information at your fingertips. And those of you who think like historical researchers will, however, be only too aware that some of the information out there is, to put it nicely, a little bit less than accurate. Something you have to look out for as a researcher. But as a repository of information, the internet is quite a newcomer, really. In my primary and early secondary school days, I'm going back to the mid to late 90s now, if I was researching a school project, that often meant calling on the assistance of a 15-year-old copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, which was like so thick. It was doorstop thick. It might mean a trip to the reference section of the local library, seeing if we got any books on the subject lying around at home, or wonders of wonders, after about 1997, it might involve using the amazing and wondrous contents of the Microsoft Encarta CD-ROM. That was the homework miracle of its day. But let's go back further in time. What about the years before then, the decades, the centuries before then? In the early 1900s, you might have favoured the approach taken by R.S. Porter. On the 24th of April 1908, R.S. Porter, whoever he or she was, had a very simple question published in the Yorkshire Notes and Queries column of the Bradford Weekly Telegraph. Who can inform me if there is any inscription on the Saxon font in Kirk Hammerton Church? That was all they wanted to know. Who this R.S. Porter was, I'm not sure. They didn't give an address, and I cannot find anybody with those initials living in Bradford in 1911. Of course, there's no reason to suppose that they even did come from Bradford. All I do know is that they had a question, they couldn't answer it, and they were hoping that maybe another reader might help. Rather bizarrely, the answer, referencing Porter's original question, was not published in the Bradford Daily Telegraph. It appeared a month later in the Shipley Times and Express. One Arthur Miller put pen to paper. I noticed a query re Saxon font at Kirk Hammerton Church. The old font is not now in use, as it unfortunately got mutilated in the restoration of the sacred edifice. That would be the restoration that I mentioned earlier on in the 1880s, 1890s. The font is round, no pedestal, very large and massive, no inscription whatever. The letter was signed Arthur W. Miller, St. Margaret's Road, Bradford. Looking further into the same edition of the paper, Mr. Miller appears to have been quite the historian. Arthur Miller also replied to a query about the lost churches of the Holderness area of Yorkshire, referencing Ravensborough, Redmer, Thalthorpe, Frishmarth, Hornsey Beck and several other long-vanished places. From his letter and the knowledge he shared, he sounded as though he was quite a serious academic. Could he have been a teacher? He certainly seemed knowledgeable enough. Here's the thing. According to the 1901 census return, 38-year-old Arthur Wade Miller was not an academic, not a teacher, not a professor, nothing of that kind. He was a brass finisher. Born in Stockton-on-Tees, he appears to have moved with his parents and siblings to Leeds and then to Halifax before he was even 5 years old. In 1890 he married Eugenie Patterson, and almost 11 years later they were indeed living at St. Margaret's Road, number 226, in Bradford, with their little daughters Elsie, aged 8, and Edna, aged 5. Very typically late Victorian girls' names there. Looking further afield, I discovered an edition of the Yorkshire Factory Times from October of 1893, which added the interesting information that young Arthur Miller was a fairly active trade union leader, active enough to justify an extremely detailed biography that even tells us that he attended Christ Church schools at Halifax and then St. Philip's School in Bradford. He later moved to Harrogate, and after his death the newspapers noted that he had served as the secretary to the Bradford and District Amalgamated Brass Finishers Union, so he's certainly a union man, for over 50 years. So he really was a knowledgeable man, and maybe we shouldn't be so surprised that he wrote so many letters to the newspapers. For a visit that merely came about because I was taken by the sight of this interesting roadside sign, I think it's fair to say that Kirk Hammerton Church has proved rather interesting. It's led me to discover all sorts of stories of people that I would never have known about otherwise, and maybe it just shows us that we should pay attention to those little roadside signs. There's a lot of history out there, a lot of interesting people have existed, and it is absolutely fascinating to find out who they are sometimes and connect them to these various historic places, because it's all part of social history.